Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the History and Development of Madison's Railroads. I am Haley Page, the Exhibition and Events Manager at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, and we are thrilled that so many of you have showed up for our summer members-only program. As many of you know, we offer free programming every month on various topics related to railroad history, art, photography, and much more. These programs are available at no cost, but tonight we want to show our appreciation to our valued members whose generosity and support literally drive everything we do. This exclusive event is dedicated to you, our members who contribute at the $50 annual membership level and above, so thank you very much. Before we begin tonight's event, I want to announce that again that we are recording the program tonight, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube page in a few weeks' time. Since this is a members only event, the video will be unlisted, but you can send an email to me or Scott or our info account to get a recording link in approximately 2 weeks' time when we post it. And if you need that link again after we send it out or you didn't receive it, just send us an email. And we can also send you links to all of our past members only programs as well. And that is at info@railphoto-art.org if anyone doesn't know our email. Additionally, you can find a wide selection of our previous free monthly programs on our YouTube page, and that is at youtube.com/railphotoart. Before we get into tonight's program, as usual, I'm going to provide some quick instructions on Zoom's controls before handing the mic over to our presenter for the evening, Scott Lothes. As a reminder, we use Zoom webinar for our presentations, and this means that you do not have access to your audio or video during the event, but you can change how you'd like to view your presentation in that top right corner of your Zoom screen under the icon View. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a number of other icons. Use that chat function for any comments you have during the presentation, and by selecting everyone like you see on the right-hand side of the screen, you ensure that the rest of the audience can see your comments. And use the Q&A icon to submit any questions. Following today's presentation, as usual, we will be hosting a Q&A session. If you have a question at any point during today's presentation, you can post that in the Q&A, not the chat, to make sure that we see it. All right, well, I'm very happy to introduce our presenter today and really the true engineer of the center, Scott Lothes. Scott became the center's full-time executive director in 2011 and editor of the center's journal Railroad Heritage in 2013. Growing up watching coal trains in West Virginia, he has been fascinated with trains since his earliest years. He took up photography while attending college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where he graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. Throughout his career, Scott's work has been widely recognized with over 600 of his photographs and 70 articles featured in publications such as Trains, Classic Trains, Railfan and Railroads, and Railroads Illustrated. He has also authored and co-authored 8 books and contributed articles and photographs to numerous magazines. Since moving to Wisconsin in 2011, he has undertaken a project to document the railroads of the upper Mississippi River Valley, where he enjoys hiking and camping with his wife Maureen and their dog Maddie, who is a frequent office visitor and who can, continue to come as often as she likes. And with the center headquartered in the state capital, he has also become a bit of a resident expert on Madison's railroading history. In particular, when we acquired the collection of our founder, John Gruber, a few years ago, we began unearthing a true treasure trove of photographic materials from around the city and around the county dating back to the 1940s. The historical record that John alone created is something truly special, and one that I know Scott has had a lot of fun exploring, especially as he's been researching and putting together tonight's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott so he can take this away.
All right. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Haley. I'm not sure resident expert is something I'd use to describe myself quite yet on Madison's railroads, but it sure has been fun to learn more about them and to do so through John's wonderful photography, which has encouraged me to photograph around here more as well and get more familiar with these places. And you mentioned Maddie, and she is, well, I wouldn't say tuning in. She's more sacked out on the futon next to me, but she is with us in spirit at least tonight. So let me get my screen share going and get this train out of the station. All right. Is that showing up correctly?
Looks good.
All right, well, let's take it away. And thanks again for everyone joining us tonight, all of our members at the center who literally make possible everything we do. Thank you so much. We also have some guests from the Lexington Group in Transportation History joining us tonight. Their Overton Award has helped fund research into a project we're now doing about the Rails to Trails movement, which I'll say a little bit about at the end. The Lexington group does a wonderful job in honoring and keeping alive the transportation history of the United States, and we're really glad to have some of you with us tonight too, and be happy to make this program available to all of your members as well as all of ours at the Center. So let's get started here, and I should tell you all that this is actually the 6th version of this presentation that I have given in the past 6 months. The first one came about thanks to our work with the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. We're partnering with them on a railroad-themed walking tour that will be debuting with them on September 17th here in Madison. If anyone wants to come join us, we'd love to have you. You can learn more about that on their website, which is madisonpreservation.org. And as part of this, they invited me to make a presentation about Madison's railroads for their winter lecture series on Zoom this past winter. And from that, turns out that railroads are a pretty popular subject here, and not just in our rail enthusiast community. My other presentations have all been in person, and those have been to a local history organization, a group of civic and academic leaders, a social club, and also as part of a place-based workshop at the University of Wisconsin. Now, these are all general audiences, not rail enthusiast groups. And so for each of those groups, I've really tried to connect the railroads in Madison to the national railroad story, and the positive reception for these presentations has been really gratifying. But what I want to do tonight is something a little bit different for all of you. This is the first time I've given this presentation to a railroad audience, and you already understand the importance of geography and the steam to diesel transition, deregulation, as well as who shot the passenger train. So rather than focusing so much on any of those big picture topics, I thought we'd take this opportunity to take a deeper dive into more photography by John Gruber, our principal founder of the center, and someone who was an extremely talented photojournalist who created really a singular record of railroading in southern Wisconsin that spans the 1940s into the 2010s. So most every railroad in this part of the world is hinged on Madison. Every line on this map we're looking at right now was built because of Madison. And at their zenith, 9 different railroads stand out from Wisconsin's capital city. Here is a locator map at the left there for reference. And 7 of these lines remain in service today, at least in part. And I will also touch on 2 other lines that appear at the upper right of the map and that were built specifically to avoid Madison. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. Now, I should also note that I've omitted a few lines that would appear near the far right edge of this map for simplicity's sake, since I won't be dealing with them tonight, but I want to acknowledge that they're there, because I know this is a very knowledgeable audience tonight. And I will come back to this map a lot, so don't feel like you have to remember it. But before we dive in, I want to say a few words about the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, particularly for the benefit of our newer members and our guests who are joining us tonight. And our mission at the center is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. Railroads and photography came of age together in the 19th century. This is a glass plate from our Jim Shaughnessy collection, and that visual tradition is vibrant today. This is a 2019 photograph by Justin Franz, one of our board members, showing young and old photographers with Union Pacific's Big Boy in Ogden, Utah. And there are literally hundreds of railroad museums and societies in the country, but the center is the only one with this specific focus on railroading's visual culture. And we also have a pretty unique business model. We don't have a museum or a gallery space of our own. We have a business office and an archival storage facility, both located here in Madison. From these, we maintain our growing collection of more than 500,000 images that provide the material for everything else we do. Right now, we are especially excited about our new online collections management system called Odyssey, which will begin rolling out publicly next week. This will provide much greater access to our digitized collections. We'll be integrating it into our existing website over the course of the summer, and probably will be populating the site with more images until the end of time, given how many we have in our archive. But look for a public announcement about that tomorrow, and then more information next week as we get it online. We're really looking forward to debuting it and getting your feedback and making our collections more accessible that way. Our other main initiatives include preparing exhibitions that go to museums and galleries all over the country. This was our biggest, Railroaders at the Chicago History Museum. Then we host conferences, events, and presentations in addition to our online webinars. This is our 2022 conference at Lake Forest College, just north of Chicago. We also make annual awards for creative imagery. The John Gruber Creative Photography Award, we'll be announcing those winners at the end of the summer. And then we publish books as well as a quarterly journal called Railroad Heritage. We're a nonprofit organization funded primarily by you, our community of members. Your support makes up about 70% of our annual income. You truly empower everything we do, and we cannot thank you enough. So in addition to our website, railphoto-art.org, you can also follow us on social media. We're at RailPhotoArt on most of the major platforms there. And you can also watch all of our online presentations at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/railphotoart. And in case any of you are still wondering why we're located in Madison, it's because our founder, John Gruber, lived here. Our principal founder. There were three involved in the beginning. John perceived the need for a railroad organization focused on imagery, and he did the work and had the connections to get it off the ground. We have grown expansively thanks to our tremendous all-volunteer board of directors who come from all over the country with a wide range of experience and expertise, and have helped us build up a staff that now numbers 10. This is most of our board and staff at our Conversations Conference this spring. And Madison is still a great home for us. It is a wonderful city with a great university. It's close to the nation's rail hub of Chicago. And as we'll see, Madison has a very strong railroad history of its own. Now, I can never say enough good things about our staff, and I have to give special recognition this evening to Abigail Guidry, who has single-handedly digitized more than 40,000 of John Gruber's negatives in the 2 years that she's been with us. Your support as members makes that possible. We also owe our unending gratitude to John's widow, Bonnie. That's John's photograph of her and their older son, Richard, in a Sioux Line dining car in 1965. A younger son, Tim, was born 2 months later. Bonnie spent 2 years organizing John's photography before donating it to us. Thanks to her efforts, we could really hit the ground running with this collection. So let's get back to our Madison map here and start filling it in. Now, if you don't know, Madison has pretty unique geography. It was built on an isthmus between two lakes, with Lake Mendota on the north and Lake Monona on the south, with downtown and the state capitol building sitting right in the middle of that isthmus. That unique geography led to some interesting railroad construction, which we'll see shortly. And when Wisconsin became the 30th state in 1848, it had no railroads. But in just 40 years, less time than I've been alive, the rail network through Madison was complete. The first line was an extension of the state's first railroad, which connected Milwaukee with Waukesha in 1851 and reached Madison 3 years later in 1854. Here it is in 1873, looking east up Washington toward the Capitol building. You can see the Capitol just right in the middle of the frame, kind of faint there. You can also see a corner of the depot on the left-hand side. This is an Andreas Dahl photograph from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I'll be sharing a few more images this evening from the State Historical Society to fill in some of this early railroad history in Madison. And when this line arrived in 1854, it was the Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, which was chartered to build from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Continuing west out of Madison, it arrived in Prairie du Sac on the Mississippi River in 1857. So that was less than 10 years after Wisconsin became a state, and it was just 3 decades after the dawn of railroading in the US with the beginning of the B&O in 1827. So just in this short time, Wisconsin had a line running all the way across it. And this line was also special to John Gruber since it passed within a few miles of Prairie du Sac, his childhood home. So let's see a few more photographs of this railroad. These will all be John's images now. So a mile west of the Madison Depot, the railroad crosses University Avenue, seen here in 1960 with an eastbound passenger special for the Wisconsin chapter of the NRHS. Its center is the stack of the UW power plant, and at far right, you can see part of the university's materials science and engineering building, which is still there. Here's a color scene in the fall with the freight train heading west. This is also one of John's color slides. We focused most of our efforts so far on his black and white negatives, but there are some nice early slides as well. Just west of there, the tracks now run along Campus Drive, passing the UW Stock Pavilion on the far left of this image. And this is a freight train heading west on the Friday after Thanksgiving in 1978. 22 years earlier, in 1956, John was a few miles further west in the town of Cross Plains for the arrival that morning of Train 32, a mixed train that ran every morning from Prairie du Sac all the way into Madison. 19 years later, John called a westbound train leaving Cross Plains on Halloween 1975, passing the Seaman Lumber Company, which is still in business today, and I was pleased to see a centerbeam car spotted there when I drove past it this weekend. Now, going west of Cross Plains, the railroad follows the Wisconsin River all the way to Prairie du Sac, crossing it 3 times along the way. This is the easternmost and, in my opinion, the most interesting of those 3 bridges. It's located at Spring Green, Wisconsin, and this is an eastbound train in 1975. If you look at that bridge span on the far left, you can see a center pivot, and that was built as a draw span since the lower Wisconsin River once had commercial shipping on it. A few times during this program, I'm going to insert one of my own recent photographs as a comparison to John's. This is the first of those, a drone shot taken of this same bridge in 2021, and that's a Wisconsin and Southern train taking empty grain cars west. And what I want to point out here in the elevated perspective is how it really shows the sandbars that are so characteristic of the lower Wisconsin River. Those, along with the railroad, were really the demise of commercial shipping. Now, we could easily spend all night just looking at this line, but we should get back to Madison and continue our story there. Back in 1857, the same year that the Milwaukee and Mississippi was completed, we also had a 3rd line arrive that year. That was the Watertown and Madison Railroad, which provided a 2nd route between Madison and Milwaukee. My favorite John Gruber photograph of this line is on the east side of Madison, with a passenger special heading east to Milwaukee at dusk. John had climbed a boxcar in the siding for this elevated view taken along East Wilson Street. Now, here's the going away shot, which also shows the 1 block of street lighting on this line. We'll see another view of this a little bit later. These days, this line is noteworthy for the quarry it serves in Waterloo, about halfway between Madison and Watertown. It's a major source of ballast for both the Wisconsin and Southern and for the CPKC. Now, this is my drone photograph taken on the Monday of our Conversations conference this spring, and Elrond was with me for this one. The scenic highlight of this line is the wooden trestle over the Crawfish River at Hubbleton, Wisconsin. I shot this just a week and a half ago on a Friday evening after work, just minutes before sunset. Now, going back to Madison's early days, the panic of 1857 and then the Civil War slowed railroad construction all over the country. But our 4th line arrived in 1864, before the war ended. And that was the Chicago and Northwestern down there at the bottom middle. It's the thickest of the lines there, reaching all the way up from Chicago and coming in by way of Janesville, Wisconsin. Now, this line crossed Monona Bay, and so it also had to cross the Milwaukee and Mississippi. You can see where that is with the red arrow. And it did that in the middle of the bay. This is John's photograph of a Milwaukee Road passenger train about to cross the Northwestern. And this is my drone photograph of a Wisconsin and Southern grain train on the former Milwaukee Road. You can see the state capitol upper right, and also a whole bunch of ice fishermen on the frozen bay out there in the distance. This is a wider and higher view of that same train showing even more fishermen. This might be the only place in the world where 2 railroads cross at grade on causeways in the middle of a lake, right here in Madison, Wisconsin. But Madison also had 5 other diamond crossings. And if you follow the Chicago and Northwestern line to the upper right, that railroad reaches the isthmus there. And it also had to build diamonds with the Madison and Watertown Railroad on the east side of the isthmus. And those wound up right in the middle of Blair Street, which you can see in the upper left of this photograph, which looks east. This is a 1936 glass plate by Angus McVicker from the Wisconsin Historical Society. The detail in his glass plates is just phenomenal. And 19 years later, John Gruber took this shot at the same location looking the other way, back at the isthmus. And what we see here is a very clear reminder of just what railroad arrived first. Left, we see a Chicago Northwestern passenger train stopped and waiting while that lowly Milwaukee Road switcher trundles by with a few freight cars. Milwaukee Road was there first. Back in the 19th century, Madison's next line arrived in 1870. When the Madison and Portage Railroad connected those 2 cities. And at this point, one of the 2 major rail systems in Madison was complete. 4 of these five lines came under the control of the Milwaukee Road. It's also worth noting that in 1881, the Milwaukee built a branch line to Sauk City and Prairie du Sac, out there on the left side of the map, where John Gruber would spend his boyhood some 6 decades later. Now, the Milwaukee Road was truly Wisconsin's hometown railroad, but it would grow to become an 11,000-mile system that reached from the Ohio River to Puget Sound. In the process, all of Madison's lines were relegated to secondary branch line status. Now, to see why, let's look at our map again. We've already covered the Madison and Portage and the Madison and Watertown railroads. The Milwaukee Road acquired another line that ran straight between those two cities via Columbus, Wisconsin. This line is straighter, flatter, and shorter than the route through Madison, which includes a 1.5% grade over Arlington Hill, which is pretty steep for this part of the world. Madison's local traffic paled in comparison to the long-distance trade that began flowing between Chicago, the Twin Cities, and the Pacific Northwest. So all of the Milwaukee's long-distance freight and passenger trains ended up running via Columbus, and that route is still a busy main line today, now part of the new CPKC network. And yes, I'm still getting used to that mouthful of initials. Now, Columbus itself has a beautiful 1906 depot, and since 1971, it's also the closest place to Madison where you can catch a passenger train. Columbus is also a great example of John's approach to photography. This view shows the Amtrak agent dragging a baggage cart across the tracks on June 3rd, 1979. Now, here's a westbound Hiawatha train arriving in Columbus in 1970. And here's another one departing eastbound in 1968, heading for Milwaukee and Chicago. Here's an Amtrak train making its station stop in 1982. And here's another one from 1983. Now, there's nothing particularly special about these days or these trains. These are everyday photographs of everyday activities, just slices of life down by the depot. This one's from June 19th, 1976. I love that composition. But John kept coming back here again and again on these average days. Record what happened another day at the depot when the passenger train came through. In the process of photographing the ordinary, I think he created a record that's extraordinary. He photographed the Madison trains too. Even though they were local and regional, their service was still pretty impressive. All 4 Milwaukee Road lines in Madison had daily freight and passenger trains for much of the 20th century. In 1940, the timetable listed 11 trains daily each way between Madison and Milwaukee. 8 of those ran via Watertown and 3 more swung south through Milton. There were also 2 passenger trains each way between Madison and Portage, where they made timely connections with the mainline trains. And there were also 3 pairs of daily trains that ran directly between Madison and Chicago, bypassing Milwaukee by way of Janesville. The fastest of these, called the Varsity, made that run in 3 hours flat. Now, this is a mid-60s edition of it at Monona Bay. Now, going west from Madison on the former Milwaukee and Mississippi Railroad, there were also 3 pairs of daily passenger trains at this time. This is one of them, and I apologize for this blurry photograph, but it's the best one I've found of it so far. This is March of 1956, still nearly 4 years before John got his first really good camera. But we can still make out the 2 locomotives and 8 cars of Train 22, the Sioux, on its 900-mile run to Chicago that started in Rapid City, South Dakota. In 1874, the Milwaukee had built an incredible pontoon bridge over the Mississippi River, linking Prairie du Sac to Marquette, Iowa, and ultimately South Dakota. The right end of this train is on the pontoon span, and it actually floated on pontoons. That's how they let it open for river traffic. There was even a small steamboat station there to open and close it. You can just see it with a wisp of smoke to the right of the train. John is looking south here from the Highway 18 bridge in 1961, just a few months before this bridge closed for good. Back in Madison, though, the Milwaukee Road's main facilities were always in the 600 block of West Washington Avenue. Our current depot is the 3rd structure on this site. It's a neoclassical brick building built by the Chicago firm of Frost and Granger. A striking feature about the depot for me is that it only had 1 platform, meaning that it could only serve 1 train at a time. And that must have been something of a bottleneck. Although for decades, the Milwaukee Road had a 2nd depot in the city. It was called East Madison and located on the east side of the isthmus. The first structure there was built in 1869 and was a pretty simple one-story affair. That's it in the center, and again, you can see the state capitol faintly right above it. This view looks west from Williamson Street. Now, as the city grew, the railroad built larger structures here, including this one, circa 1918, which was later replaced by a hip-rift depot, similar in style to the larger one at West Washington. You can see this in the middle of this striking Angus McVicker image. By this time, the Milwaukee Road was calling the station Franklin Street, which came in from the right. Excuse me. This station lasted until 1952, when the Milwaukee Road consolidated all of its remaining passenger operations to West Washington. Here it is in a 1956 color slide by John. There's a passenger train at the depot and that wisp of steam from its heating line, and then two freight trains stationed in front of it. The Milwaukee Road's freight traffic through Madison was pretty substantial, mostly agricultural products and manufactured goods from Wisconsin heading to Chicago and beyond. One of the biggest shippers around here was the Oscar Mayer plant on the east side of Madison, and it was a hive of activity in this 1942 aerial photograph. This view looks north from Commercial Avenue. Packers Avenue now runs just to the right. That railroad line cutting diagonal upper right is the line Portage. John said in the 70s, the Milwaukee Road ran a freight train to Chicago every evening. And the last move they'd make was to pull 15 or 20 of these reefer cars out of Oscar Mayer and tack onto the head end of that train so they could head straight to Chicago with it. This was still big business up until a few decades ago. So we'll head back downtown now with another aerial photograph. And this one shows all of the Milwaukee Road's key structures in Madison for both freight and passenger. We're looking west here, and that is West Washington, cutting across the lower left corner of the frame. In the lower right corner is the Hotel Washington, which served railroad passengers, but ultimately burned down in 1996. Just above the depot is the baggage building, which is now a nice restaurant called the Harvey House. And then above that is the Madison Freight Station for Milwaukee Road. You can see the roundhouse there at top middle, and if you look right above it, that street there is Regent Street, which leads almost directly to our offices on the west side of town. And you can see that jog in Regent Street, which I'm pretty sure is there because of the roundhouse. So the roundhouse was there first, and when the road was built, they had to make a curve there to avoid the roundhouse and the railroad property. The roundhouse was a half circle with 18 stalls, and in the upper right corner, you can also see the polling tower. And other than the depot, very little of this remains today. The turntable and roundhouse are completely gone, and the City Station Shopping Center now occupies this site. At least there's a nod in the past there. Demolition came in stages. By 1983, just 6 stalls of the roundhouse were still standing. A year later, the freight station was being torn down. This view by John looks east with the passenger depot in the distance at right. John was even there for the removal of the turntable, which started in 1986, was still in progress in 1987, and wasn't actually removed until 2 days after Christmas in 1988. Quite a lengthy ordeal. Going back to the aerial photograph, I also want to point out that West Wash crossed no fewer than 12 tracks down there. This was a busy street, and this was a busy railroad yard at the time. There's only one track that remains today. But the only visible protection here are the 2 crossbuck signs with flashing lights in the middle of the street. No gates, despite exponentially more trains than we have now. There was, however, manual crossing protection in a wonderful piece of vernacular architecture that is just out of frame to the left. That was an elevated watchman's tower, seen here in John Gruber's photograph from inside the cab in 1963. On the left side of the frame is the former Kroger warehouse, and at the time it had 3 boxcars on its spur track for unloading. For the photographer lucky enough to be allowed upstairs in that tower, as John was in 1956, it offered a commanding view. And that is a Milwaukee-bound passenger train that would run via Watertown, getting ready to pull out in this winter scene. So that kind of gives you the Milwaukee Road here in Madison. Now let's take a look at their main competitor, the Chicago and Northwestern. We've already touched on their first line into Madison, which arrived from Chicago in 1864 and made that diamond crossing in the Manila Bay. By 1873, the railroad had extended that line north and west to Baraboo and Reedsburg. This is a pretty interesting and scenic stretch of railroad, and John photographed it quite a bit. So let's take a quick look at a few of his photographs of it. We crossed the Wisconsin River at Merrimack, seen here with the Rochester 400 passenger train heading west in 1961. Merrimack is also the location of a state highway ferry, which still runs. The current boat is the Culsack 3, Culsack for Columbia and Sauk counties, which it connects. This is John's photograph of its predecessor, the Culsack 2, in 1973. It looks pretty similar to the current vessel, but its predecessor looked a little bit more primitive. This is the first Culsack ferry back in 1958. I'm not sure I would have wanted to ride across the icy Wisconsin on a winter's day on that little ship, but John Gruber did, and I believe he even photographed this train from the ferry. This is a winter day in 1959 with a Northwestern freight train heading west on a dark December day. This is right after John got his first really good camera, a Nikon F, which he would use for almost his entire life. During a couple of brighter winter days, 2 months later, at the end of February, John made a nice series of pictures showing railroad mail service at Merrimack. This view at the depot looks east, and the bridge is just around that bend in the distance to the right. Now we're looking west from the depot, and I believe that's the station agent standing there on the track next to his car. I've not been able to find out his name yet. I'm hoping John may have written it down somewhere. Here he is hanging a mail bag by the depot. This is February 27th, 1960. And here's the westbound 400 passing. It's already caught the mail bag on the rack, and the worker here is just tossing out a bag of mail for the station agent to pick up. You can see it on the ground there. Back inside the depot, the agent prepares to open the mail bag and sort its contents. And even though the 400 trains didn't stop in Merrimack, they still connect to the rest of the world through this mail service. 10 miles to the northwest, all of the Northwestern passenger trains stopped at the Hanson Depot in Baraboo, which still stands. But this is train 501, the Viking, in 1955. It made an all-day run from Chicago to Minneapolis, stopping at Baraboo in the early afternoon. This was the same day, a couple of hours later, and from the other side of the tracks. This is the westbound Dakota 400 streamliner. Most of those buildings to the left are no longer there. Baraboo played a prominent role in the history of traveling circuses and is home to the Circus World Museum. From the 1960s into the early 2000s, the museum ran a circus train in Milwaukee many years on the 4th of July. Here are the preparations for the 1965 circus train with a team of horses positioning one of the historic wagons for loading as a big crowd watches. These are all John's photographs here. And here it is crossing the bridge at Merrimack behind Burlington 282, number 4960. It's common in these days for one of the restored or still operational steam locomotives to power the circus train. Here it is again 2 years later, this time with the Grand Trunk Western 5629 doing the honors. And we'll follow this train into Madison. This is the village of Dane, Wisconsin, where John captured some of the crowd that was out to see the train. The railroad looks like ran one of their inspection cars on the tracks ahead of the train, probably to help get people out of the way. And here comes the train storming into Dane on the 1% grade of Dane Hill on this beautiful summer morning. And here it is in Madison. Before continuing to Milwaukee, the train made a servicing stop in Madison where it attracted an even larger crowd. And that included the local fire department, who provided one of their pumper trucks to fill the locomotive's tender with water, since I guess the water tower was no longer there at this time. Note the Schlitz sign on the side of the tender. Schlitz was a big brewery in Milwaukee, and they were the sponsor for this and many of the other circus trains. Lack of corporate sponsorship in later years is one of the biggest reasons that these trains stopped running. But thanks to John and others, we have literally hundreds of great photographs of them in our archive. Here's one more with the train and its historic wagons rolling across Lake Monona beneath the Capitol building in 1985. So now that we're back in Madison, we'll return to our map and go back to the 1880s when the Northwestern was still expanding. They built a line to the southwest. You can just barely see it down there. That line went eventually all the way to Galena, Illinois. They also built to the east with this line in Milwaukee, and that is the line that the circus train often used. And so at this point, In less than 30 years, the two biggest railroads in Madison have fully staked their claims to the city. And unlike the Milwaukee Road, the Chicago and Northwestern through Madison was very much a main line. The line from Chicago going up through Bearview and Reedsburg was their principal route to the Twin Cities, and traffic on this line swelled. The Northwestern built a freight yard and locomotive shop on the east side of town to handle much of this business. A part of this roundhouse actually still stands and is home today to a property management firm. Back in 1956, John managed to get inside it to document a few of the steam locomotives there that were awaiting their fate. Sadly, the word condemned is stenciled on this cab of this 10-wheeler. Now, the Northwestern had wanted to work with the Milwaukee Road to build a Union passenger station in Madison, but from what I've been able to discern so far, the Milwaukee wasn't interested in doing that. And so the Northwestern built its own passenger station on the east side of the isthmus. I've not yet found a photograph of the first depot there, but this postcard shows the second, which was built in 1885 and included both a hotel and a restaurant inside. John's photograph from 1982 gives a good view of the current structure, also designed by Frost and Granger and built in 1910. It is missing its passenger platforms in this view, but you can see them below that wonderful neon sign of left in this picture. This is a 1957 colored slide by John as a very dirty Dakota 400 pulls in from Chicago on a pretty dreary February day, but I just love the glow of that neon sign here. The Northwestern's facilities extended for several blocks to the east beyond the depot. This was their passenger, all their passenger facilities. The freight facilities were further to the east. This is John's photograph from 1955, looking west with the Capitol in the background behind that quartet of brand new SD9s. Obviously, the water tower here would not be needed for much longer. You can see the passenger platforms far left of this scene too. If those four SD9s seem like a lot of big power from Madison with their dynamic brakes, remember that line to the northwest of the Wisconsin River, which had 1% grades and sharp curves. And again, this was the main line of the Northwestern of the Twin Cities when it first opened. But like the Milwaukee Road, the Northwestern decided to build a brand new 140-mile railroad between Milwaukee and Wyville, which it nicknamed the Adams Line, since it passed through Adams, which became an important stop. Compared to the Madison route, the Adams line is arrow straight and pancake flat. If we go back to our main map, we can just see a little bit of the Adams line up there, upper right, passing just south of Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. Now, this map shows all of the Chicago and Northwestern lines in Wisconsin in 1910. This was the original line from Chicago to the Twin Cities, which ran via Madison. The proposed Adams line is shown here, dashed. Once it opened in 1911, long-distance trains now have this option to go via Milwaukee to get between Chicago and the Twin Cities. And for the next half century or so, at least from the timetables I've looked at, the Northwestern used these two lines pretty evenly. So service through Madison remained high, with about 4 or 5 passenger trains in each direction per day, plus about as many freight trains. But of course, we all know that didn't last. And John was there for the final run of the 400 through Madison. This is it stopping on its last day, July 23rd, 1963. Milwaukee Road passenger service held on for a little longer, and it even included football specials that brought fans from Milwaukee to Badger games in Madison. This one was arriving on East Wilson Street on November 9, 1968. The houses and trees are still there, but you'd never know a railroad used to be. This is the same spot of the 1300 block of East Wilson in the spring of 2022. We go back to Tom Mickelraith's wonderful photograph. Should note that the Badgers were terrible in 1968. They went 2 consecutive seasons without winning a single game. On this day, they lost to undefeated Ohio State by a score of 43-8. Now, our football fortunes began to improve in the 1970s, but sadly not our rail service. When Amtrak created its national rail network, Madison was not included. So the last passenger train left Madison on April 30th, 1971. A lot of freight traffic also left Madison by this time. The Northwestern began sending all of their long-distance trains to the Adams line. This is up in North Lowell, Wisconsin in 1978, a Glenn Easterite photograph. Union Pacific still runs its freight trains between Chicago and the Twin Cities over this line. Thanks to precision scheduled railroading, there's only one manifest train per day, but can sometimes be close to 300 cars long. So we've now covered 8 of Madison's 9 railroad lines. And that final one came from a third railroad, Illinois Central. It came up from Freeport, Illinois, on a branch line that was built in the late 1880s, and this never really became a major route. The IC did build their own passenger and freight stations in Madison. They were located next to the Milwaukee Road depot, just to the northeast. The freight station still stands. You can see it in the background of this photograph, and today it is part of U-Haul and very busy when these students are moving in and out of town. I believe the passenger station may have been torn down sometime in the 1940s, but I've had trouble finding too much information about these yet, so work remains to be done here. I do know that a mixed-use building now occupies this site, and it has a CVS at ground level and condos above. If you look closely, in another nod to the past, that building is called the depot. A freight service continued into the 1990s, but traffic volumes were pretty low, as this 3-car train attests. But still, this was an interesting line with some impressive earthworks, including the Stewart Tunnel, located about 20 miles south of Madison. Back in town, the IC had to cross the Milwaukee just east of Camp Randall Stadium, where the Badgers play. This view looks west with a short IC train on the left there behind a borrowed Bangor Aroostook locomotive, and it's waiting for the Milwaukee Road train on the right. The protection for that crossing came from a pair of manual gates, and that smokestack in the background is for the university's power plant, which was coal-fired and rail-served until about 2010. In fact, John even got a picture of a coal delivery there. This happened in 1985. Now, I do want to mention another item of note on this line, the Badger Works. This was an ammunition plant built in the early days of World War II near John's childhood home of Prairie du Sac. The Milwaukee Road extended its branch line north to serve the plant, and the Chicago Northwestern also built a spur off their main line from Merrimack. Now, I don't think John ever got inside the Badger Works to photograph them, but he did catch a Milwaukee Road train pulling inside the fence in 1975, just before the plant closed at the end of the Vietnam War. Badger is a fascinating footnote to southern Wisconsin's railroad history. The plant had its own rail network with both standard and narrow gauge trains. Raw materials came in by rail, finished ammunition was shipped out by rail, and during World War II, the Milwaukee Road even ran special passenger trains to transport workers to and from the plant from residences around Madison. I learned a lot about this because I gave another version of this presentation to the Badger History Group, and I would encourage you to check out their website if you're interested. They're doing some nice restoration and interpretive work on what remains of the Badger site today. Take a quick look at the Milwaukee Road Sauk branch, since this was John's childhood railroad and the first one he photographed. One he always made a point to return to, like he did so frequently in his photography. This is the local freight train, which ran out of Madison in front of the depot in 1951 behind a 10-wheeler, which was standard power for the train in the late steam era. The depot still stands, and it also sat very near to the dividing line between the twin communities of Sauk City and Prairie du Sac. Served both of them, and the depot even carried signs listing both of their names. The southern edge of Sauk City, the railroad crossed the Wisconsin River on the line's signature structure. This was the third bridge on the site, and it was built in 1942 to accommodate heavier traffic due to the Badger Works. The second bridge crossed a back channel with a pair of Pratt trusses. The calm water here made an excellent swimming hole, and local teams used the bridge as a diving platform. John photographed their antics extensively on a few different summer visits in the 1970s and 80s. By this time, train traffic was down to maybe just once or twice a week, and the speeds were very slow. So even though you shouldn't do this, there wasn't much risk at the time. For me, it is another great example, though, of how John took such an expansive approach to railroad photography, making a point to photograph the local kids using the railroad bridge to jump in the water. It was just a great example of how completely he tried to photograph the railroad scene. Let's turn back the clock then and look at a few trains here. This is December of 1955, and by this point, a Fairbanks Morse diesel has replaced the 10-wheeler. Here it's leading a long train across the river and into Salt City. On a November day in 1959, John called an RS-3 passing a group of kids out sledding in an early snowfall. Later that afternoon, he shot the same train heading back to Madison, south of Salt City. I just love that low, late afternoon sunlight raking across the scene, highlighting the outside brazed wood boxcars. But not long after the Badger Works closed, the Milwaukee Road stopped maintaining an agency here. John was there for the last day on July 31st, 1975. The depot does still stand, thankfully, but this was the last day it had an agent. Inside, he found the daily yard check and report of freight cars on hand. The first line of the report says, quite simply, Badger, blank. No cars there. Only 2 customers remained, a creamery and a can company. Both of them had about half a dozen cars on hand, although some of them had been sitting there for 2 weeks at this point. The last agent on duty had to pack up everything in the boxes, which John also photographed. And that task fell to a rather unlikely employee, Cynthia Skidmore Lambert, at the time one of just a few women station agents on the entire Milwaukee Road system. She spent 8.5 years with the railroad, working as a relief station agent from June 1969 to December of 1977. She worked all over southern Wisconsin and even as far away as Ontonagon, Michigan. And in addition to making her portrait at her desk, John also stepped outside and recorded this haunting view of Cynthia gazing through the screen door. I have to wonder what she might have been thinking. She probably had more boxes to pack and then would have been off to some other lonely depot or work another summer vacation relief stunt for some other station agent with more seniority than she had. It's just kind of a dark time for the U.S. rail industry, but John kept right on shooting through it. It was an interesting time, too. With its bankruptcy and then deregulation, the Milwaukee Road was looking to abandon many of its branch lines in southern Wisconsin. In some cases, the state stepped in to preserve rail service, contracting with some pretty colorful operating companies along the way. One of them was called the Chicago, Madison, and Northern, resurrecting the name of the company that built the original Illinois Central branch line. And you've got to dig that logo with the Capitol dome on it. Now, they'd had some success with another ex-Milwaukee Road line at Janesville, but when they took on the Illinois Central Gulf's branch to Madison, they acquired a real mess. It's a couple of views what the track looked like at the time. John was there for the last Illinois Central Gulf train on January 30th, 1981, and he was there for the beginning of Chicago, Madison, and Northern service on February 4th. He chased their first train out of town that afternoon, F-unit pulling 3 covered hoppers. And a month later, he was there for a promotional photo shoot where the CM&M's lines crossed in Monroe, Wisconsin, about 40 miles south of Madison. That's the Milwaukee Road line from Janesville on the top, and then that's the Illinois Central line from Madison on the bottom. John had friends on the CM&M, and he used that access to make a rich visual study of this operation. He truly shot it all, from the paperwork inside the depot, to the workers out on the line, and of course the trains themselves, from every possible angle. All smiles on the caboose platform on this run. He even pulled in some of our animal friends from Wisconsin's ubiquitous farms, and passing local icons like Camp Randall Stadium here in Madison. But this lasted barely a year, when the CM&M made its last run to Madison on February 28th, 1982. It was a dismal winter day with their F-unit running long and forward. John still made the most of it, though. There was no fanfare in Madison this time, just a final trip across the diamond at twilight. The once proud Milwaukee Road was looking pretty sad in Madison by this time. But even as more and more of the tracks got lifted, the story wasn't over. A new company called the Wisconsin and Calumet took over and did better, although it would close the IC due to its poor condition and lack of business. Still, the Wicket, as it became known for its initials, found some success. And then, like a lot of upstart companies, it was acquired by a bigger one. Wisconsin and Southern, the railroad we continue to see in Madison today. This is my drone photo with the Chicago-bound grain train on the former Milwaukee Road. And as the Wisconsin and Southern succeeded, it expanded, leasing all of the former Chicago and Northwestern lines, including the one along Douglas Lake, seen here in my view from the West Bluff Trail. And as the Wisconsin and Southern grew, it also attracted attention. In 2011, it was acquired by Watco, which still retains the Wisconsin and Southern's corporate image. This is a train of sand and gravel on the former Northwestern bound for the Lycon plant in Oregon and helping fuel some of the new condos and multi-use buildings that keep going up in Madison. The only railroad here that isn't part of the Wisconsin and Southern is the former Madison and Portage, which the Milwaukee Road never abandoned. Today it's part of the CPKC, and they send a local freight train down from Portage a few times a week. This is my photograph from Goose Pond near Arlington. So that gives us our current railroad scene in Madison. The Wisconsin and Southern's base is the former Northwestern Yard on the east side of town out near the airport. Local freight trains run several days a week on each line out of the city. Their cars get combined into a big train that departs most mornings around sunrise, bound for Janesville and ultimately Chicago. Here it is on a summer morning in 2020 with a pair of mallards taking flight at lower left. John Nolan Drive was pretty quiet on this day back in the early stages of the pandemic. Railroaders call this location MX, which is short for Madison Crossing. And it also has one of the newest pieces of track in the city, a curved connection that follows John Nolan Drive and allows these trains to transition from the Northwestern tracks onto the Milwaukee Road. We'll look one last time at our map and to go over all of these changes as we wrap up tonight. Most of these lines remain, but they've changed greatly. Many of them are now just stubs, and the abandonments and consolidation that happened did lead to some new opportunities. The former Chicago and Northwestern's Adams line through Beaver Dam is now a main line of the Union Pacific, shown in yellow at upper right. The former Milwaukee Road main line through Columbus is now a busy main line of the CPKC, shown in red. It's where the Empire Builder runs to, and they also have their branch from Portage into Madison. Everything else is operated by the Wisconsin and Southern, and their lines are shown in gray. Most of the abandoned lines have been converted to trails, and those are the dashed green lines. Here's the IC from Spooner Street, taken in the 1970s on the left, and then how it looks in 2022 on the right. The Rails to Trails movement has roots in Wisconsin. 80 miles northwest of Madison, 3 rail trails converge in Elroy, all on former Chicago and Northwestern lines. They include the nation's first rail trail, the 32-mile Elroy-Sparta Trail, which begins 2 blocks north of the depot here and features 3 tunnels. And back in Madison, the former IC can be pretty busy on a Badger game day. We know that rail trails can be anathema to many rail enthusiasts, but we've also realized that they are one of the primary ways the general public interacts with railroad space today. And in that, at the center, we see an opportunity. So we're developing an exhibition about rail trails that explores the notion of how railroads connect us, even when they no longer exist. Haley's taken the lead on this and is really putting together a great narrative. She's sourced historic photographs from our collections, as well as others from a few different archives. And she's also reached out to many of our members to provide contemporary views. Madison is a great starting point. We have an outstanding and well-used trail network here, thanks in large part to the railroads. We even have 2 rail trails that cross one another on the southwestern edge of town. This is John's photo of an ICG train going over the Northwestern in 1975. And here's the same spot in Haley's photo from the fall of 2022. Now, from this genesis in Madison, we developed a national narrative for an exhibition we believe can travel to venues all over the country, bringing our nation's railroad story to new audiences all along the way. The Lexington Group in Transportation History has been one of our early funders for this project with Overton Award. For the members of that organization who joined us tonight, thank you. To everyone, stay tuned for more about this project as it continues to come together. It all flows from our mission at the center, to preserve and present significant images of railroad. We're able to do that because photographers like John Gruber created these images in the first place. This one shows the 400 arriving in Madison in early 1963, the last year of its service. I firmly believe that the best people to document any place's railroads are the people who live there. No one knows the place better. No one is better positioned to tell its story and take advantage of the unique opportunities that come along. John's work is a shining example of that. I've sure enjoyed the chance to share more, but with you tonight, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Good job, Scott.
Thank you.
I can see new pictures every time I see this presentation.
That's part of the fun.
Yeah, no, there were a few great ones in there. It was great to. I especially loved that one. I mean, it's a sad picture, but it was the triptych, and it showed what was the rail the
Oh, the
Illinois
Illinois
Central
Central,
and
the yeah.
well, everyone, please, if you have questions for Scott, send those to the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can. And I'll just start us off. So Scott, I know you've obviously lived here for a few years, and you're a railroading, aficionado in many ways. But what is something interesting or something you didn't expect that you learned while putting together this presentation?
Oh, that's a good question. And honestly, it was some of the fun shots I found that I included in other versions and didn't tonight just for the sake of time, was that there were some really great pictures that John had, actually, some of the campaign trains that came through, and including some from as late as the 1960s. I think in 1968, there was at least one a Senate candidate who used a campaign train. So just seeing stuff like that. And I mean, even as rail service diminished in Madison, there was still such a tie to the community. I mean, there's football specials that ran. Amtrak continued to run some of those even into the 70s. One of our members, John Mellors, has private passenger cars that made a few of those early trips on those football specials. So there was just a lot of stuff like that that really showed how closely the railroads were tied to the community. I mean, Madison was built before the railroads came, but the coming of the railroads was just tremendous to the expansion of the city and the state and the whole country. And so it's fun to take this little local subject here and tie it into that bigger story. And I think that's something that really resonated with some of the other audiences that I've given this talk to. And I think more than anything, it's been really heartening for me to see that lasting fascination with railroads from the general public. I mean, as I said, this is the sixth version of this talk I've given, and the first one to a rail audience. The others have been for general audiences. So it's really great to see that interest still out there. And I think it speaks well for the future of our rail trails program and some of the other stuff we're thinking about doing going down the road.
Yeah, well said. Well, let's get into some of the questions from the audience. Some questions about John's black and white work. Do you have any idea what sort of film and filters he used, and if he kept any notes on that?
I know he did. I don't know that off the top of my head, so I'm going to defer that one until I can look it up and come back with a more informed answer.
Okay.
I do know he shot from about late 1959 onward. He shot, I think, for all I could tell, exclusively with Nikon Fs. I think he had 2 or 3 of them. He was still shooting with one when I met him in the early 2000s. And he really favored the 28mm and the 85mm lenses. He didn't use 50s very often. He did sometimes use longer lenses. I think he had a 135 and a 200. But that sort of 28 for a bit of a wide angle and an 85 for sort of a medium telephoto really were the 2 lenses that were on his cameras all the time. And I think it shows, when we have these wonderful zoom lenses with our digital cameras today, but John with these 2 all manual Nikons and 2 fixed focal length lenses just created exquisite photographs. And it's a great reminder that it's the photographer far more than the equipment.
Yeah, definitely. Looks like we have a question from Justin, our board member.
He's on here. Oh boy.
During this deep dive, and you touched on this right at the end in your closing, but how has it changed your own approach to photographing your local scene?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, certainly it's made me a lot more aware of what used to be here. And so that's, kind of spurred me to do some more then and now photographs, using Don's as the starting point and trying to compose that same scene. But also just having a better sense of what used to be here, I think, can just inform how you photograph in the present, even if you're not trying to take the exact same photograph. Just having that sense of what used to be here and why things played out the way they did. can open up some new interesting storytelling possibilities. I mean, as soon as I got a drone, I wanted to go out and get photographs of Monona Crossing, and that's been a fun place to explore. But there was just so much more to Madison beyond that, and how it all tied into the local and regional economy and transportation network. So I think just the more you can find out about anything, the better position you can be to make meaningful photographs of it.
Yeah, so get out there and photograph your own communities.
Yeah, and dig through your local archives too. I mean, most historical societies are going to have railroad photographs from the early days. Certainly if we have any in our collection, we'll be glad to make them available to the extent that we can. And I think finding those historic photographs is a great way to help you appreciate your own contemporary photography. And like John did, go out and shoot the local scene.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a couple of questions at the top on the Q&A about that Chicago Northwestern, the one they called the Ridge Runner line that ran out into southwestern Wisconsin and at one time had gone all the way to Galena, Illinois. I don't know whether John photographed it any or not. If he did, I don't think it was very much. I do know, however, that we have some very nice photographs of it in our Wallace Abbey collection at the center. Not a lot, but he made at least one trip in there in the early 1950s and photographed both steam and diesel powered trains on that line. And got some nice photographs of the workers, I think, out around Montfort, Wisconsin, in the southwestern part of the state.
Yeah, and I believe most of the Wallace Abbey collection is available on our Flickr page. So you can
we have a lot of highlights there, but I'm not sure whether any of those pictures are on Flickr right now or not. It's certainly candidates to add to that new collections management system.
Absolutely. Stay tuned more for that. Well, let's dive into some of these kind of more factual questions. So did John take any pictures of the Chicago Northwestern line to Dodgeville? And
that was the same one. Sorry.
Oh, that's the same line? Okay.
Yeah.
And see, we have a question about the original 400 that ran through Madison.
So the original 400 would have been Chicago to Twin Cities train, and I think that one would have run via Milwaukee by that time. But it was the 400 was named for the fact that it was 400 miles between Chicago and the Twin Cities, roughly. And the Northwestern then adopted that name for many of its streamlined passenger trains. The one we had through Madison was called the Dakota 400, which ran out to South Dakota, coming from Chicago up through Madison and then going west and across the Mississippi River at oh gosh, why can't I think of the name of the town? Winona, Minnesota. It had a bridge there, and then ultimately across Minnesota and into South Dakota. And that train was cut back from South Dakota to just outside of Rochester, Minnesota in the early 1960s and renamed the Rochester 400. And then it was ultimately abandoned in 1963. I think there was still an unnamed local passenger train that ran between Madison and Milwaukee for a couple more years until 1965. But the end of those last runs of the 400 in 1963 were really kind of the end of substantial Chicago Northwestern passenger service in Madison.
Do you know when the last Northwestern passenger train left?
Well, I mean, the last ones of any substance were the 400, which would have been July 23rd, 1963. And then, as I said, there were those locals that still ran to Milwaukee for, I think up until 1965, although I don't have an exact date on that.
Okay. Let's see. So, Tom Weaver asked, John seems to have been there for a lot of these last trips. Do you know if there was a community of enthusiasts as well who were there noting these endings, or if
I certainly think so. I know John had a lot of friends at the railroad, particularly the Milwaukee Road, and people who were able to get him inside access. He obviously had friends at the Chicago, Madison, and Northern. So I think there's some, quite a bit of connections he had both to the enthusiast community and to the railroaded community. And the railroaders were really interested in their history and wanted someone like John there to document some of these last runs. I mean, the industry was just changing so much, and I mean, a lot of these things were reported in the news too. I mean, some of the pictures of some of these last runs, you can see a news camera car off in the background. So I mean, it was still big stories in Madison when a lot of these things were happening.
Mm-hmm. We also have a question kind of noting the grittiness of a lot of John's photography. Is that, what can you comment or expand a little bit on what might be the cause for that?
Well, I mean, I think, for one thing, John photographed in black and white and, wasn't sort of bound to the sunny day rules of slide photography. And I think that was an intentional decision. I mean, I think he wanted to show the grittiness. And, Wisconsin, I think, was a pretty kind of gritty industrial state with a strong blue collar and manufacturing history. A lot of the urban renewal that really defines Madison today hadn't started at the time these pictures were taken. And so I think that was just what was there. So I don't know that John was trying to amplify that, but he was certainly photographing the place as it existed. And I think there was a lot of grittiness to it at the time.
Let's see, looks like we've got a few more coming in. I'm trying to respond to a few and
oh, sure. Well, I've got the list up. A couple of these I think I can do pretty quickly. And yeah, Tom mentions that the former IC depot was also the Badger bus depot. That was the freight station that was used as the Badger bus depot. I think it was also even used as Jimmy Carter's campaign headquarters in 1976 in Wisconsin. So it's had a few different lives, but of course it's been a U-Haul facility for a while now. I think I have that right. That was the freight station. I think the passenger station came down earlier, but again, I need to do a bit more research on that. It looks like Mike Blazak commented that the last Northwestern trains between Madison and Chicago were August 1965 protected mail contracts. I will have to look into that. I know there were still Madison Milwaukee trains in the 65. And yeah, appreciate the comment, and I'll have to look into that for the future versions. And then Dan Cupper asks about the multi-billion-dollar corridor expansion plan that Amtrak has mentioned returning intercity passenger service to Madison. My understanding of that, if it comes to pass, would be a second service between Chicago and the Twin Cities. And if you saw my map earlier, how the current Amtrak service is on that diagonal going through Columbus. And that, if the second train is added, it would cut off at Watertown, go due west to Madison, and then take the line to Portage back up to connect to the existing track. So it would be, I think, added on the line between Madison and Watertown and between Madison and Portage. Some of the challenges with that is, if you want to get all the way into downtown Madison and the Isthmus, you've got a ton of grade crossings. You're going to have some really slow track, and it's just going to take a long time to get in and out of the city. So I know there's been some hearings scheduled here to look at possible depot locations. And so in addition to stuff right downtown, they're also considering sites out by the airport. And that's where they make that turn to go from the east-west line to the north-south line. So you'd avoid a lot of the slow congestion on the Isthmus, maybe with a direct dedicated bus service to connect the depot there to downtown. Much as I love downtown service, that option by the airport seems like the more practical one right now, but we'll see what comes to pass.
Circling back on your previous comment about Madison being built in a very uniquely geographical area, and one that we're having other sort of expansion problems with beyond rail.
Yes, yes. Only so much room, but when you build a city on an isthmus.
Yep.
And I see a couple of people asking about possible books, and that as we've looked at our publishing plan at the center, we're really trying to publish more books that can draw from a number of our collections rather than monographs about a single photographer's work. But I have to say that for our founder, John Gruber, we may have to make an exception for that. There's certainly an abundance of great material there. It's something we feel pretty strongly about trying to do at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see there's a question here about the E6 or E3 switching.
Yes, that was definitely an E unit. And I that was one of those the railroads that came in between the Milwaukee Road and the Wisconsin and Southern. And I think it was a former Atlantic Coastline unit, but I will have to, again, don't quote me on that, but I can certainly get back and look it up. But yeah, kind of a rare thing to have those short line cab units providing freight service in Madison, as we saw sometimes even running long head forward because there was nothing else available and they couldn't turn the engines around. But they did what they could to keep the trains rolling.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we've gotten through most of the questions here.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for tuning in tonight. It sure is fun to share more of John's photographs with you, and we really appreciate your interest in them and appreciate all the feedback too. If we ever do turn this into a publication, we certainly want to correct any of the mistakes and add as much information as we can.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Scott, for taking the time to both put this presentation together, give it for, would you say, the 7th time?
This is the 6th tonight.
6th, and making it unique for this audience who obviously know a lot about railroading, but are always keen to hear more about in-depth histories and especially see more of the photography of John Gruber. So it was a great learning experience and great, education for all of us. So I just want to remind everyone that we are recording tonight's event and it won't be posted publicly on our YouTube channel because this is a members only event, but it will be unlisted and I'll be emailing that link out to all of the people who registered for tonight's program. And I'm just dropping the link again to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/railphotoart. You can find all of our past monthly programs there, SAN, our members only ones. If there's any that you haven't seen that you want to see, we've done in-depth look at the John Gruber collection, a little an early dive into the Steinheimer collection right after we acquired it. I think those are really the only 2 we've done so far. So this is our 3rd one. But yeah, send us an email. We can send those links out to you. We'll be posting this in about 2 weeks. And just our early announcement that our next online program will be on July 25th. That's a Tuesday. It'll be the photography of Lynn Westcott, presented by Kevin Keefe, one of our board members. And we're really excited to learn more about that as well.
Yeah, Kevin actually brought a few of those slides over for us to scan for him earlier this week, and I can say from seeing those that you're going to be in for a treat with that program.
Yeah. With that, I'll if any parting words, Scott, go ahead.
Well, it's just a pleasure to share with everyone again tonight. We have such a rich trove of imagery at the center, and bringing more of it out to light is really at the core of what we do. And you as our members make all of that possible. We can't thank you enough, and we sure look forward to sharing more of it with you. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.
See y'all next month.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Haley.
Thanks, Scott.